Hello and a very warm welcome to Insight. I'm Amandra Bhatt. Today we talk about India's relations with China in the light of the recently concluded fifth round of strategic dialogue. Top diplomats of the two sides met recently in New Delhi to discuss various outstanding issues in the bilateral relationship, such as the recent spate of incursions, bilateral trade, and also the issue of trans-border rivers. Meanwhile, this strategic dialogue came amidst reports recently, unconfirmed reports mainly, that Chinese troops had intruded into Arunachal Pradesh. These reports emerged as India sent a strong message to China on Tuesday by landing its Super Hercules transport aircraft at an airstrip in the DBO sector near the LAC, which was the site of the 21-day-long April standoff. And to discuss the same, we have with us in our studios three distinguished guests. Please welcome Professor Sreeram Chaulia, who's a Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs. He's a noted international affairs analyst. Welcome to Insight, Professor Chaulia. Is Sanjay Kapoor, senior journalist, editor, Hard News. Major General Sheru Thaplyal, who's a noted defense expert. He's also somebody who specializes in India-China relations. Welcome to Insight. Professor Chaulia, how do you look at these reports, just coinciding with the India-China strategic dialogue?
Well, you could call it as an attempt to kind of sabotage this, but then, these have been happening with regularity. Even when there are no dialogues, you often hear these reports. And as Sanjeev you mentioned, there is this huge gulf between the official narrative and that of the private media. And I don't think it's good for national interests for this to become too divergent to a point where, because national interest, after all, and action based on it, has to be based on some kind of consensus about what are our core principles and bedrock, territorial integrity, sovereignty, all these things. So it harms these eventually to have, divert too many viewpoints. So I think both sides have to make an effort the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. There are Chinese incursions, but as officials say, there are also Indian incursions to the other side, because Chinese media is closed and tightly controlled by the state, at least the traditional media, as in newspapers and so on. They don't report Indian intrusions. But the Chinese do, say in private that your side also transgresses. So, because of the undefined nature, but, I get alarmed when people say 20 kilometers, Daulat Beg Oldie was supposed to be 19 kilometers, something.
Some are even saying 30 or even 60 this time.
See, but that's alarming, because, if there is a difference in perception along the line where you're talking of, 4 or 5 kilometers this side or that side, you can understand it's part of the fog of this fuzziness. But, these seem to be deep into it. So, why are they doing it now? Is this a time-tested strategy that's been restarted because there's a new leadership in power and they are, trying to test out India? And the other factor is, as General was saying, they come in and then they vacate. And so what is this cut and thrust all about? I mean, how do we understand this? Why don't they stay put?
No, but now they are starting to linger on. Earlier they stayed put for 21 days.
They do vacate when we raise the issue. And so what happens often is that it seems like it's a demonstration of their superior abilities. And as General was saying, they do look for more vulnerable points along the long border where we are not prepared yet. And if you go to the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement, which is being discussed for some time, initially the Chinese were, totally against the idea that we should build our fortifications and maybe reach some kind of strategic parity with them on our side. But now eventually, apparently after 4 months or 5 months of wrangling, they've finally agreed, they've dropped that insistence that India should not do any kind of build up on our side of the border. So that clearly shows that they want to maintain the advantage. And through these actions, these small provocations, it may be, in the long run, it may be just a pinprick. But what it does is it shows that, we want to maintain the relative balance of power on in our favor. And I think India has to respond both by talking to them at the strategic, at the foreign secretary level and all those things. But at the same time, we have no option but to keep building on our side.
Okay, so we have to keep talking to China, keep the dialogue process open. Professor Chaulia, how do you look at this issue of LAC, and do you also get the sense that China is perhaps reluctant to settle this issue with India, because they have sorted out their border issues with other countries, they've sorted it out with Russia, they've sorted it out with their Central Asian neighbors, they've done it with Myanmar as well. Why not India?
Yeah, I think the record says that out of 23 territorial disputes that China had since 1949, some 17 or 18 have been settled, more or less. Ours is one of the unsettled ones. Actually, Taylor Fravel, who's at MIT, has written an amazing analysis in the International Security Journal about why China settles some of its disputes and keeps the others boiling. And his argument is essentially that where China senses regime instability and regime threat internally along the border, along international borders, it settles those quicker. For example, you spoke about Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajik, all these three countries. The reason the Chinese kind of settled them, they claim to have made concessions, but it's disputable. But anyway, those borders are kind of settled now. And the reason the Chinese have done it, according to Taylor Fravel, is because of the fear that the Uyghurs, which are on the other side of the Central Asian nations, Uyghur minorities in Xinjiang, will receive moral, diplomatic, economic, military, all kinds of support from across the borders. And then it will lead to secessionism within China proper, mainland China. So that's one reason. So, and then if you look at their settlement with Russia, again, they sensed a vulnerability with the northeastern part of China, which borders southern Russia. And the other factor is, of course, the strategic one, which Sanjeev has mentioned, where where they find some kind of alignment with certain countries in order to move them away from the United States sphere. Then they are willing to make some so-called agreements. But often, many of these settlements, it's not necessarily true that the Chinese give up and settle. What they do is it's a bargaining ploy. They first make maximal demands.
Okay.
I want whole of Arunachal, right? And then they say that now we are kind of scaling down, we are becoming more reasonable. Eventually you give me half of it or 1/3 of it.
Okay.
So that's been the pattern of many of these settlements they've been doing with other countries. So we should not read too much into it, but it is nonetheless a factor. So what is the lesson for us? If Taylor Fravel is right, it means that unless there is major disturbance in Tibet Autonomous Region, as they call it, it's not really autonomous, it's completely under the PLA control. And that's why, we can never discount the fact that Tibet is still a card for us. Some people say it's nothing, we've given up and all that. The point is, if there is major, disturbance in Tibet, which could lead to rebellion, like you had in the 1950s and the 60s, which could seriously threaten China's sovereignty over it, then it's going to be more amenable to settling that part of the border with us. So this is the kind of, intrigue that goes on. To try and decipher the real intention and motivation of the Chinese is like reading worse than tea leaves, because it's very closed, and probably not even people in the Politburo are all clear as to who's determining India policy and what kind of decisions they are taking. So it's always a guesswork. But I think we should look at the historical pattern. So Mr. Bambawale, who was Joint Secretary of East Asia in the MEA, I had a discussion, and he was saying, maybe we are also not ready for a final settlement. It's not only China. And I said, what do you mean? He said, it's about relative power also, right? If China is 4 times our size now, and if you go by the projections, we're looking at, from 2020 onwards, according to the economists, we will start growing faster than them due to demographic changes and all that, right? So maybe it's in our interest to grow stronger and to deal with them from a position of strength. Because another factor which they do when they settle is if the opponent is weak, they like to settle, because then they do it on their terms, right? And they get more concessions. If the opponent is roughly once equal or even superior, that's when they struggle and they are reluctant.
But in any case, it would require concessions and compromise. Are we prepared for that?
Well, we should be. See, at the end of the day, why should we be wasting our resources endlessly and get bogged down like this? The Chinese want us to be bogged down. They use Pakistan to also bottle us down and to keep us within Asia and not become an intercontinental or a global power, right? And at the end of the day, we don't want war with China, right? We are wary of them. We are very, very wary of them, but we don't want war. I mean, that's self-defeating me.
Okay, Professor Chaulia, how do you look at the trade issue? It was taken up in the strategic dialogue. The trade imbalance is a long pending issue. India has in fact sought market access for pharma, agriculture, IT, and even buffalo meat, because India, we understand, is the world's largest exporter of buffalo meat.
Yeah, there are two levels at which this problem has been addressed. One is at the G20 and at multilateral forums. Many nations which are trading with China and are in the red have accused it of undervaluing its currency, of predatory exports, and all these things which produce these kind of massive deficits. And the Chinese have been very, very defensive about it at international fora. In fact, the Brazilians have also had a problem. It's not only the Americans and the Western nations and the Europeans who've been, fighting trade wars with the Chinese. So the general problem is that China, the way it subsidizes its manufacturers and primes them to dominate other markets, does create a lot of fear among importing nations that it will be deluged and flooded. And India has often used countervailing duties and all these things against this kind of dumping, as it's called, anti-dumping measures. So from time to time, so with the Indians, what we are doing is now to try and also talk bilaterally about this deficit, and to show that, I mean, technically speaking, from a pure economic point of view, deficits are okay, because the idea is that imports are not bad because they also help bring down prices and increase consumer utility. But the strategic with China, we cannot just be talking normal economics, right? It's a massive neighbor. It's 4 times our size, and it's militarily also conventionally and unconventionally stronger than us. So therefore, the fear will remain. So we have to look at the trade dialogue as part of the larger problem. Although there's sometimes an attempt to de-link the two and to say, the economics is going on fine and we should let it go on. The point is, even though it is 75 billion, heading towards triple figures soon, it is lopsided. And eventually, when you count national strength, it goes back to my earlier point about relative power. How do you measure hard power? It includes economic might, right? If the exchange is so unequal and unfair, and it is actually adding to the relative power of the Chinese vis-a-vis India, should we be, happy about it? So therefore, I think Indian industry, I think the concerns they are raising, the demands they are making for opening up certain sectors must be, supported full-time. And I think the Chinese do realize that they should not push us beyond a point where they think that they can get away with expanding this deficit. Because a point will come where, let's presume, at the rate at which it's been rising, that one day it's going to hit 50 billion. And at that point, we are going to have to raise tariffs, and use extraordinary measures to protect our domestic manufacturers. The WTO rules allow, in the case of serious damage and injury to one's own producers, to also, batten down the hatches. So that time is not far away. So the Chinese don't want to lose our market also. Remember, that's our card. I mean, at the end of the day, we are a consumption-based economy. Chinese do want to access it in a big way. The other thing is the investment side. We are encouraging foreign investment from the Chinese in infrastructure in order to try and somehow make up for the deficit which has been growing between the monetary flows on both sides. And I think I've written about how we need not be too paranoid, because even the Americans are inviting Chinese capital for investing in their infrastructure after getting the security clearances. We will keep some of our sectors closed for sure, but then the Chinese money is also welcome. So that's one way of trying to balance out this trade deficit.
What about joint projects such as this Bangladesh, India, China, Myanmar corridor that is being talked about?
Borders should be open if you are a believer in liberal trade. And the ultimate, the famous comment of Dean Acheson, which still rings in every diplomatic corridor, is, if goods do not cross borders, then armies will. Liberalizing trade and easy movement of people and civilian sector, goods and commodities, is good. It's always good. For example, Chinese, I was in Beijing last year, where we had met delegations from the southern Chinese provinces, Sichuan, and they are thinking somewhat differently from Beijing, which is far away from India. So they're talking about how regional trade can actually bring benefits to both sides. And in India also, as you know, there is this whole phenomenon of constituent diplomacy where the provinces are taking some subsection of the overall foreign policy brief into their hands to promote especially economic exchanges directly with neighboring countries. So I think our northern states and eastern states, and there has been some kind of limited movement in the past as well. I think there's no harm in thinking about extending it and creating a regional cooperation structure on the economic side. But all that will eventually, as I said, you cannot really separate the military from the economic here, because we're talking of China. We are not talking of some mid-sized country which is far away. So therefore, they have to be fair to us. And I think that is a message that we are consistently sending by demanding that we have to bridge this trade deficit.
Well, another area of convergence between India and China, as we discussed earlier, would be Afghanistan. Our interests are on the same side in Afghanistan. Both India and China have invested heavily in the reconstruction of that country. But do you see our ties with Japan and the US affecting that particular dimension? Professor Chaulia?
China and India may in principle have commonality, as in both are opposed to Islamic extremism emanating from the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. But the Chinese have often tried to use their special relationship with Pakistan to directly kind of cut a deal with them on this issue. So it's very often the case when the Chinese leadership meets the Pakistan leadership, they tell them, keep these guys under control. They can trouble anybody else. I don't think Chinese mind that there's jihadi violence in India or terrorist attacks in Kashmir and all these places. What they mind is, if it comes and spreads into Xinjiang and all their own internal problems. So I think the Chinese, because of the Pakistan factor, it's not so clear that we'll cooperate with them on Afghanistan. But one thing is for sure, like both Indian companies and Chinese companies are taking mining contracts now in Afghanistan. So if they have taken Ainak, we are trying to take Hajigak and all. So to that extent, it may, provided Afghanistan does settle down, I don't know when, we may say kind of a normal competition like we have between Chinese and Indians in Africa, for resources. That's okay. I mean, we can live with it. But if the Chinese are using these cards to try and hem us down, that's when, the strategic anxieties increase on this side. And I think, we should also talk about China-India in the wider world. I mean, at multilateral fora. I've been always arguing that the biggest confidence-building measure, forget, border issues and all which we have been managing for a long time with difficulty, biggest CBM is if China unequivocally says we support you for permanent membership of the UN Security Council. They've never done that. There are allies of the Chinese in our media. There's one particular newspaper, which everybody knows is has been pro-Chinese historically, English language from South India. They have been kind of like trying to create an impression that the Chinese are okay and they are now going to support us on the Security Council membership. But the statement after statement is continuing to confound. It's part of the confounding strategy that we discussed with the border also. They're not very clear about it. And certainly they say that we are opposed to Japan. And we are not particularly antagonistic to India joining, and they say we welcome India's role. But they're never unequivocal about it. So I think, they have to, at the end of the day, if they don't want an adversarial relationship with us, they will have to make some of these, game-changing maneuvers. For example, Xi Jinping coming out openly saying, we support India's membership in the UN Security Council. It is not going to happen. It's unrealistic right now. Because they, as an Asian power, their vision has always been to try and monopolize and not to cede ground to any other fellow Asian power on the world stage. That's a big clash, the fundamental clash, where we want, a more multipolar Asia, but they want a unipolar one. So this is a deeper issue of strategic outlook where we differ. So at best, I can say that, India and China can live with their differences and maybe minimize the damage. But damage cannot be completely eliminated because of the structural nature of this competition.
Another issue that concerns us would be the issue of trans-border rivers, Brahmaputra in particular, dams that are coming up in Tibet Autonomous Region. We understand India wanted to set up a joint mechanism on this matter, but China is not okay with it. Professor Chaulia?
I just want to add, when Xi Jinping met Barack Obama recently, in an informal setting, they spoke about a new model of bilateral relations, and the reference is to the historical pattern where major powers have often feuded and ended up, collapsing the whole world into conflagration. So, can we also create a new model of relations in Asia, where there are two rising powers which are both ambitious and both want to be seen as leaders of the developing world? This is the big challenge. So I think if you look at the global picture, it's going to be, this is a laboratory. All these things eventually India and China can ignite World War III, or we can actually